seconds. 1, 2, 3. Yes. And we are live on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, tons of different outlets. Hello again, everybody. This is Corey DeAngelis, the Executive Director at the Educational Freedom Institute. I'm joined by my co-host, as usual, Matthew Nielsen, who is the founder of the Educational Freedom Institute and the current president of the board. We have an amazing guest with us, a close friend, Inez Stepman. She's the Senior Policy Analyst at the Independent Women's Forums. Thank you so much for coming out, Inez.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, so we start pretty much the same question with each of our guests, which is a little bit of a background in how you got interested in education policy and anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself.
Sure. Actually, I think the way I got interested in education policy is probably instructive to what we're talking about today. I had just finished up college. I was looking at interning in Washington, D.C., and I had to rank for when I applied to the Heritage Foundation, actually, to be Lindsay Burke's intern. I'm sure Lindsay has been on here. So when I applied, I had to rank the different departments, policy departments, in order of my interests. And I actually put education first, never having really delved into the issue of school choice at all. The reason I put it first was because I thought we have a civics crisis in this country. Americans are not learning enough about our country's history, about the unique institutions of this country. We're not learning the things we need to learn to sustain a republic. Now, this is a decade ago. Dating myself there, but that was sort of my primary concern. And it was only when I got to Heritage that I started to learn about school choice and how those two things might interact. But I think it's very relevant, right? There is no issue more important to the future of this country than what we teach the next generation about being American. It's the purpose for having public schooling at all in this country. If we go back to the original public school system, it was the original reason given for public investment in education in a country where so much was left to the private sector. Why do we have fairly early on public investment in education in the republic? It was exactly for that reason. So that's really why I got into education. It's really why the issue is important to me. It's just unfortunately become more and more obvious why we need to think about education in that way, instead of just thinking about, NAEP scores or whether, test scores are going up and down or down. We need to think about it in a more fundamental way about preserving the qualities and the education that's necessary to preserve the republic.
So go ahead, Corey. But I have questions.
Well, on that same note, Inez, well, how has it turned out for us, this experiment with this government-run school system? I think you're right that the original argument was to have a more cohesive society and a well-functioning democracy. What's kind of happened over time? Has it gone well? Has it not? What is your take on it? And if it hasn't gone well, what are some of the main problems?
So first of all, let's separate the early American public school system, the investment in universal education, from the common school system that we recognize today, more or less, which is a unified, publicly run, i.e. government-run system. When Thomas Jefferson would argue with Benjamin Franklin about whether or not we ought to invest in public education, as like taxpayers, as a society, he was not talking about having the government run schools. He was talking about investing in what were often parochial or private schools on a locally run basis. But he was basically saying, if we are going to have at that time universal white male suffrage, obviously we've expanded suffrage well beyond that in intervening years. But he was saying, if we are going to have a republic, we need to have some form of basic education for citizens. Otherwise, we will not be able to sustain our self-government, basically. And that was the argument that he made. And I think those arguments definitely ring true. Now, whether that translates into a government-run system, I think we all agree it doesn't have to. There are other ways to invest in what I would call a public education that is nevertheless not monopolistically run by the government, and more importantly, not monopolistically run by one sort of team, the culture wars, that has a very, very negative view of this country. And what we've seen now, ironically, is that the common school system was introduced to Americanize the children of immigrants. That was a time when people were very worried about Americanizing, with some good reasons and some bad reasons. But it was a time where people were worried very much about whether the children of immigrants, mass waves of immigration coming to this country, whether their children would Americanize or whether they would fundamentally change the country in their image. And ironically, what we're seeing now, I think, is the system built to Americanize the children of immigrants is un-Americanizing American children, whether they're native born or they have immigrant parents, and that's a huge problem. It has to be dealt with. I think there are lots of different ways, and we probably need them all to deal with that problem. But one of the ways to deal with the problem might be to give parents more leverage over what's taught. And I don't see a way to do that other than to give them leverage over the dollars that we spend on behalf of their children.
So one of your, I guess it's your pinned tweet, looks a little bit like this. No nation can survive if it teaches its children to hate their country. As you can see, it went pretty viral, 22,000 likes, over 4,000 retweets. What was kind of your going through your head as you were, tweeting this thing out? And what's kind of the backstory on that viral tweet? And do you have some examples of things that are going on in the school system that kind of put some alarm bells going off?
Sure. Notice that's early October in 2020. That's right after we basically completed this summer of riots surrounding and after George Floyd's death, right? I think it's really obvious that the riots were not only connected to that particular incident, not only connected to policing. That's the summer where we saw people tearing down statues of George Washington, tearing down statues of Abraham Lincoln, and basically vandalizing any symbol of the country, of our common history, whether we're Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. The goal obviously is to get Americans of all different backgrounds to have some connection to our history. Look, my family came to this country in 1987. In no sort of bloodline way am I connected to George Washington or Frederick Douglass or Abraham Lincoln. And nevertheless, they are my heritage. This is my country, and I have a very intimate and I think well-informed by historical fact connection to that history. And it's been very clear to me for some time that our schools are actively cutting that connection for particularly students of color, but really for all students. They are taking the worst parts of American history, of which there are plenty, as there are for every civilization in the history of the world, but taking those things out of context, oftentimes twisting the very historical facts underlying it in the way that the 1619 Project did, right? In a totally debunkable way, has been debunked by historians from left to right. So in some cases, outright lies. In other cases, just a lack of context and emphasis. The remarkable thing about America is not that we had slavery in this country. The remarkable thing about America is not that we had a ongoing war with the natives of this land that resulted in a civilizational clash and essentially their destruction. That's not remarkable at all in the history of the world. It is the history of the world. What's remarkable is that we built a civilization based on the principles of 1776, that we built a country that does recognize our fundamental equality, that does give citizens their God-given liberty or natural liberty, right? These are the remarkable things about this country, not the fact that there was blood and slavery and war. Blood and slavery and war are the history of every civilization, including, by the way, native civilizations, but every civilization in the history of the world from day one until now. So the lack of context of America's strengths and greatnesses, when juxtaposed against our failures, our weaknesses, and the black parts of our history, this perspective to me, first of all, is just wrong, objectively wrong when you take into account the context of world history, but also is particularly damaging in a country like America that is multi-ethnic, that is has people from all over the country, all over the world rather, with different religious backgrounds, different family backgrounds, right? We have to have something that ties us together. that is not as easy as perceived kinship, for example, or blood. It has to be something, an allegiance, at least at the 10,000 foot level, to this project we call America. And I think it's so dangerous, particularly in this country, to teach what looks like our generation, right, millennials, and then the one that comes after us, Gen Z. It looks like we've taught two generations of Americans only the negative things about their country and only the exaggerated negative things about their country, and taught them essentially to see each other as strangers rather than as fellow citizens, to see each other as oppressors or oppressed.
Mhm.
This is incredibly dangerous. This cannot continue. That's what I was tweeting about it. It's sort of worried me since I mentioned, since I got into this work a decade ago. But it's certainly accelerated, I think, specifically since the summer of 2020. And we're seeing the fruits of it now. But the optimistic thing, of course, is that people are waking up to what is happening. It's so obvious now; it cannot be ignored anymore, especially as so many families had their kids on Zoom school for the last year, which, if anything positive can be said about it, and not much can, at least it gave parents a real window into what their children were actually learning, and that words like anti-racist or equity, critical race theory, these things have a lot of content that the majority of Americans still find really radical and objectionable, but they sound fairly innocuous. And so I think connecting the dots on what those things actually mean, they mean that your 10-year-old is going to learn about his personal privilege and be ranked in his class against his fellow students based on how many quote unquote privilege points he has. I mean, when parents see that that's actually what it means, since they have in the last year, one, it hopefully is engendering a huge backlash, and two, it becomes incumbent on us then as policy people, as policy wonks and people who deal with the law and the legislation, to actually back these parents up and give them the kind of leverage through policy, the courts, and the law that they need to get the job done. That's what I see as our job is, I think.
So I want to like Phonologic said, a Twitter user, amen and hallelujah. I'll second that. I want to just draw the connection between something you said earlier and what you just went over, Inez, if we can. So Ben Franklin was talking to Thomas Jefferson, and his argument was that we have to have an educated populace in order to maintain the republic, right? So, and then you just talked about what we're actually doing now, which is we've warped reality. We've changed history into something that it's not. We've rewritten it in a way that isn't just inaccurate, but it's damaging, right? I would argue. And so we're not only are we not doing what Ben Franklin said that we need to do in order to maintain the republic, we're doing something that, in my view, is damaging. So I wonder if we can just put a finer point on that and talk about the fact that we're not just not doing something, we're doing something that is harmful to the republic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument from education reformers for so long has been, look at these terrible NAEP numbers, look what kids aren't learning. I want to say, look at what they are. We've replaced really basic instruction that you would think that everybody could agree on about, reading and writing and arithmetic, right? And what we've fed kids instead is a narrative. Now, the narrative is easy, right? In a sense, it's an invitation to total mediocrity, right? Because it's not difficult to grasp the narrative that America is bad and racist and evil. It's not actually challenging in any way to students, and it's not challenging to teach. But it is, as you say, very, very pernicious and dangerous to the country. What's difficult is actually, teaching content, right? Teaching real American history that requires study. It requires actual teachers who know their subject instead of just knowing a glossy variation of a type of narrative that they want to teach. But yeah, I do think it's become a net negative in many ways. What we're seeing, I think, what Americans have already realized about the academy, right? The university transferred down to K-12, right? So if you look at the polling on trust in universities, it's gone upside down in the last 5 years. Before about 5 years ago, yes, Republicans trusted universities a little less than Democrats. There was a gap there, but overall, there was a strong majority in favor of the proposition that universities were a net positive to American society, right? Yes, there was some crazy stuff going on in some departments, but overall, Americans generally supported higher education in this country as a net positive. That's no longer true in polling. It's not only no longer true for Republicans, it's no longer true for independents. So we see trust in universities have fallen off a cliff because of the politicization of universities. And I think what the three of us and many of our colleagues are trying to raise the alarm on, and so many other excellent folks like Chris Rufo, like Barry Weiss, like this brave teacher, Paul Rossi, who published in her Substack about his private school, by the way, that was teaching these kinds of doctrines. What they're saying is, look at what the academy has come to K-12, right?
Yeah.
The ideas, the radical ideas that germinated in the academy have metastasized to K-12. I would argue that's been going on for decades, as people say, slowly, and then all of a sudden, right? Even when I went to public school, and again, I'm going to date myself, but I graduated in 2006. And I grew up in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area in California, so super lefty sort of environment. And my public school was already teaching this bent towards American history. Now, were they teaching the 1619 Project that didn't exist yet? Obviously not. They weren't teaching that America was founded in 1619 and based on slavery. But they were teaching the fundamental narrative that America is, in fact, not exceptionally good. It's exceptionally bad. That America is the source of evils in the world and at home. So, I do think this has longer roots, but I think it's gotten to a boiling point over last summer because of the riots, because of the protests, because race has been thrust into the national conversation in the way that it has. That has accelerated, I think, what has been a long, slow burn through the K-12 systems as an institution that is now at a critical point. And again, the only piece of optimistic news I have to report back is that I really do think we've reached a tipping point in terms of people realizing that this is what's going on. Now, the question is, are we strong enough to stop it?
So I tweeted on Saturday that that these ideas, postmodern ideas, critical theory ideas, and that includes critical race theory, are baked in. This is the term that I used, baked into the K-12 education system in America. And it got a lot of feedback, a lot of comments, a lot of retweets and likes. But one of the comments on it was, no, this will be easy to change. Maybe it's in there somewhere, but it will be easy to change. And all we have to do is change the curriculum at colleges of education around the country. And my argument was, and I want your thoughts on this, Inez, no, false. That's not all you have to change, because that just takes care of the people that are in colleges of education today, the future teachers that will come out as graduates with a new curriculum. What do you do with all of the teachers that are currently teaching? Another thing that I didn't know until a couple of weeks ago when I was doing some research, is that the US standards, the actual standards that are used for K-12 education in the country, have elements of postmodernism in them. Like, and this is what everyone is graded on, right? So like your school district, your school, is it up to par according to these standards? There are elements of postmodernism in the actual standards. So that's what I mean and that's what prompted me to say, like, it's baked into the system. It's not like you can just say, well, don't teach that anymore, guys, okay? And use this other curriculum. Like, it doesn't work that way. It's just a system-wide issue. And so that, of course, then leads us to school choice, where we can change things like that. But anyway, your comments on that, what do you think about the system as it is relative to these ideas And how deeply embedded do you think these ideas are?
Well, here I'd use the left's favorite word. I think it's systemic. I think you're right to say it's embedded in a lot of different directions. Schools of education are an important part of this. They're often the leftiest part of left-wing campuses. So they are an important piece of the puzzle, but teacher trainings are overwhelmingly left-leaning and have elements of this sort of critical race theory or gender theory embedded in them. Sometimes state standards have it embedded in either the testing or the standard, but more often than not, these are individual district or even individual teacher decisions to bring a lot of this curriculum in. There really isn't and in some ways this is good, right? There really isn't a top-down curriculum in the United States. But there are incentives for certain things. So we saw, for example, the Biden administration come out with this proposed rule on critical race theory that's going to start awarding grants to school districts based on how well they integrate this kind of stuff into their curriculum, which is going to turbocharge a movement that has already gotten its tentacles into just about every level of the education system. But this is actually why I remain a proponent for school choice, even in the face of the kind of information we're getting from folks like Paul Rossi saying, look, our private schools are getting infected with this too. And it's absolutely true that our private schools are getting infected with it, but the prerequisite for change has to be a shift in leverage and power to parents. And if we look at how woke, to use the phrase, the reductionist phrase, how woke the school system is on every single level. That means teachers, school board members, schools of education, teacher training programs, superintendents, right? People who work in the bureaucratic offices of these schools. Across the board, I'm willing to take the bet that parents are less woke. Right. If we have a system that's controlled by these institutions and these institutionalized actors, I would rather that, opponents of school choice often, make it seem as though it's going to be like a wild chaos if we let parents choose. You know what? I'm a proponent of chaos theory. I would rather have the chaos, quote unquote, of parents actually choosing and having more power over these decisions than these institutionalized actors having that power. Because we've seen what the institutionalized actors have done. They've intertwined critical race theory and destructive gender theory, on the other hand, into every level of education, to the point where it's very, very difficult to work within the system to pull all those threads out. Now, it's a project that's important because for the time being, we still have, 80-something% of kids who are going to be attending traditional public schools. And it's important to defend the territory we've got, right, in terms of schools that reject this kind of nonsense. But ultimately, school choice is necessary. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It only provides the leverage for people to be courageous enough to use. To the point that Paul Rossi made, and to the point that Caitlin Flanagan at The Atlantic made about private schools. School choice is a fantastic policy solution, but all it's doing is giving parents the leverage to do something about it. Nobody can force. Nobody can force courage into people to reject this kind of stuff. 65% of Americans are afraid to share their political views now, and I'm not gonna whitewash the forces that will be arrayed against you if you do stand up to this stuff. I'm not trying to downplay it. They will come after you. They will call you nasty names. They will try to ruin your life. They might try to get you fired. And it's very easy for those of us on sort of this side of the microphone, right? We get paid to say these controversial things. We're sort of pre-canceled, as it were. It's easier for us. So I'm not downplaying how difficult it is at all, but that's what has to happen. School choice can only provide the baseline and the power to actually affect change once people are courageous enough to actually try to change the system. But without the school choice piece, I'm kind of skeptical that we'll get very far, in the same way that reformers have not gotten very far in changing the public school system in 1,000 other ways, right? The incentives in the system are not lined up to do anything other than what Randy Weingarten wants. Like, that's the bottom line. The incentives are all aligned away from parents, away from what parents want, and towards quote unquote professionals, bureaucrats, and teachers unions. So without changing that incentive structure, I think we're kind of dead on arrival. But even with changing that incentive structure, it still requires the courage to go ahead and do it.
So Inez, do you think the past year has amplified courage in a lot of parents? If so, how big of an effect do you think the failure of the past year on the part of the school system has amplified that courage? And then two, when families are motivated to do something and they are fed up with the status quo, what should they do? What are some of the options that they have? They're fired up. They want something to change. What do you recommend that parents do at this point?
Well, I do think there's been a sea change, and Corey, you know this better than anyone, and Matthew, you know this better than anyone. There has been a massive change, particularly with the pandemic shutdowns that went on long against scientific advice. Parents are really fed up. I think it has pulled back the veil to some extent on the fact that the school system operates for the benefit of the adults in the system. And of course, ed reformers have been screaming about that for decades, but it has really, I think, pulled, again, to repeat myself early and often, repeat myself. It has pulled back that veil. It has made parents see that, wow, these people really don't care about my kid. That is literally not what they get paid to do. And so I think that has been a huge tailwind for school choice reform. People think, oh, red states, but actually red states have been really reluctant to pass serious school choice programs for decades, right? If you look at a state like West Virginia, just in 2019, there was a huge effort launched to pass a teeny tiny little ESA program, and it got squashed. And this year they passed the biggest ESA program in the country. That's the kind of change that is happening. So that's encouraging on the one hand. And I think these two threads are starting to intertwine together as we do see more school districts open up finally, right? We do see school districts open up. Parents are, they've been watching on Zoom as we talked about, what has been actually being taught to their kids. And then two, all of this stuff is in the news thanks to the work of great folks like Christopher Rufo. This stuff has been reported on. It's getting the media coverage that it deserves, which it was not getting a year ago, even though it was happening a year ago. It was not getting the same kind of media coverage. President Trump helped enormously, I think, with that by talking about it all the time on the stump and launching things like the 1776 Commission. This gave the national media hooks about which to talk about these kinds of issues. So I think we are seeing the intertwining of these two threads, right? The one hand, the school closures that have, really, really frustrated parents and have unfortunately wreaked a lot of havoc on the progress of children in this country. And then on the flip side, as people go back to school, they realize, schools are not putting in effort to catching up their kids on reading, right? Instead, they're launching directly and with ever more fervor into this kind of critical race theory classes, race affinity groups, gender ideas, the leftist gender ideas, being introduced at ever earlier ages into like kindergarten or first grade, right? So I think the double whammy of those two things is really producing the biggest opportunity for education reform that I think we've seen probably in 50 years. And frankly, both Republicans and Democrats would be absolute idiots not to take advantage of it, particularly Republicans. They need to run on this issue. They need to stand strong on this issue. And they need to seize the moment, because we don't know how long this moment will last. And frankly, there is no more important issue to the future of the country, the future of the culture of the country, than what we're teaching kids in school. That is the future, literally.
So is school choice something that just Republican constituents care about, or is this why do you say this should be a Republican campaign issue?
Well, traditionally, Republicans have been the ones voting for school choice. There have been some very notable exceptions. Initially, school choice was a bipartisan effort. I tend to think that the education reform movement has overestimated the importance of the bipartisan part of this, in the sense that while many Democratic voters do support school choice, particularly Black and Hispanic Democratic voters support school choice by strong margins. Nevertheless, the party is intertwined with two things. One, teachers unions, and two, just absolute sort of hysterical hatred of Donald Trump, right? Anything associated with Donald Trump, they're not going to take the time to think about it as an independent issue. They're just going to say Trump said it was good, therefore it's bad. And so, but on the flip side, Republicans have not taken advantage of, I think, what could be a populist tailwind on this issue, right? Because they've been afraid. They've been thinking about a coalition that really, in my view, died in if I'm being generous, died in 2012. I think it died in 2003. But if I'm being generous, died 2012, 2013, something like that. And they're afraid to touch the culture wars. They think culture war issues are icky. They think they're intolerant and whatever else. They're silly. They're a distraction. When in fact they are the heart, in my view, of why we have a public system at all, why we spend $750 billion or whatever it is. Corey, give me the number.
It's
$750 billion a year on K-12 public education. That was the original purpose of that money. And it is not a distraction to talk about what it's being spent to teach our kids.
So why aren't groups talking about the culture war things? And do you think groups should talk about it more so? Which groups? You don't have to call any groups out, but how do you think people should approach this, and why? Yeah, why do you think they're kind of shying away from it, and why do you think it's important to touch on it?
I think it's important to touch on it, one, because the issues themselves are of utmost importance to the future of the country, and two, because they work. I mean, that's about as simple as I can get. People don't care how the money in the system is organized unless you give them a concrete reason, what that actually means. For why rearranging the money in the system, how that's actually going to impact their kids' education. And for the longest time, the education reform movement was stuck on sort of a technocratic message that I think was unpopular. And for good reason. And I think the failures of No Child Left Behind and Common Core have really vindicated the skepticism that Americans had about those kinds of technocratic top-down messaging around education reform, that didn't take into account, different regional varieties, didn't take into account the challenges on the ground, didn't take into account a lot of, frankly, teachers' objections to this. Why changing these kinds of standards every 2 or 3 years was exhausting and difficult for teachers, and it was never fully implemented for that reason. So I think it would be wise for us to move away from these kinds of technocratic messages, particularly the pre-pandemic baby of the education reform movement was technology, right? Technology in the classroom. And we're seeing that doesn't work for every kid. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't work for some kids. I mean, some kids do really, really well with virtual learning. But a lot of kids don't. A lot of kids don't. And we see that now.
We got to test it on a pretty large scale, didn't we?
Yeah, unfortunately. So I think it is important to return to the themes of what kids are actually learning, which the education reform movement has a strange allergy to. That doesn't mean implementing top-down solutions like Common Core or a national curriculum, but it does mean saying school choice is going to give you more leverage and control over what your child learns about sensitive cultural subjects. This is your right as a parent to control what your child learns. We have to flip this entire paradigm of the idea that parents are a nuisance or that they're unqualified or that they somehow their voices are unimportant and we should leave the educating to the experts. That's not how education has been done for millennia, first of all. And second of all, it is anti-American. Parents are the first and primary teachers to their children. And they have all the right in the world to object when experts try to teach them these kinds of damaging things and controversial things. They have all the right in the world to object. And they, in my mind, our job, again, is to make sure that when they object, they have the leverage and the force to do so successfully instead of being ignored, which is what we saw all last year, right? We saw both on the school closure issue and on this curriculum issues about critical race theory and all this stuff. Parents are getting ignored because they can be. That's what needs to change.
I've been thinking lately, Inez, that there's this huge opportunity in the market, in the education space for not just private schools, but charter schools and homeschool co-ops, micro schools, whatever, and also higher education, private colleges or whatever, to market themselves as not anti-woke, but unwoke. Like, we're just not gonna, I think that there's a huge group of people in the country that just don't want the stuff even to enter the classroom. Like, yeah, we'll talk about it at home, and no, I don't want you going on the anti side of that per se, but just like, it's not your job. It is not your job at school to talk to my kids about, all of these woke issues.
Yeah, I mean, the success of classical education is sort of undercovered here, right? Schools like Great Hearts, school networks like Great Hearts, classical conversations in the homeschooling world. These things are enormously popular for a reason. There is a movement back to what might be called the classical education, the one that honors the traditional Western canon, that teaches subjects in a difficult but relevant way. I think there are a lot more parents who want their kids to have that kind of education than spots where it's offered, right? So I agree with you. There is opportunity in the market. Hopefully, some smart people will put together some great coursework and start new networks of schools. But that's why school choice is important, right? We gotta put in the capital. It's really hard to compete against free. I'm actually, frankly, I'm always amazed that we have as great and robust a private school system as we do in the United States. That's not the case, for example, in France. Um, it's a remarkable thing that there are so many American families, both homeschooling and the private school sector, who would rather pay or do it themselves than accept what the public education system is offering for free, right? Obviously, it's not free. We all pay for it. And there's no reason why one side of the culture wars is owed that $750 billion every year. It is our right to claim our piece of that. Every family's right to claim its piece of that pie that is being right now funneled directly to districts that not only all the litany of critiques that education reformers have been leveling for years, that are failing to get kids proficient in reading and math, right? That are failing to teach the basics about the U.S. Constitution and various other civic basics, but also are actively, as we've been talking about for the last half an hour, actively pumping kids full of this pernicious narrative. There is absolutely no reason why we should pay for that, and there's no reason why families shouldn't feel completely entitled to their piece of this massive funding pie, which, as Corey knows, is absolutely not underfunded or a small amount of money. It's been growing for quite some time, and it's a very sizable chunk of money. And I think that there are a lot of families in this country who could think of a better way to spend $15,000 a year on their children's education than the way the education system currently does it.
It's only increased by 280% in real terms. It hasn't increased by 380%. So it's a cut in education funding over time. So devil's advocate question, Inez, it makes a lot of sense, to empower families and to fund the students directly because the money belongs to the kids. It doesn't belong to the system. But, we're talking a lot about, democracy and people getting along with one another. What if, people choose schools to where, they this kind of fragment society and people start to become less tolerant of one another because they go their separate ways? What is your response to that?
So that's not what the data tell us. That kids in on school choice scholarships to private schools actually, on the balance, come out either equally or more tolerant of people who think differently than they do. But there is the theory generally that we might be able to turn down the temperature a little bit on some of our culture war battles by separating out kids. So at least, I might be able to tolerate my neighbor's beliefs that are different from mine, but not if my kids are getting those beliefs stuffed down their throats, right? In a public school. So there might be a way to somewhat diffuse some of this tension. But on the flip side, I would argue there is nothing more divisive or than what the public school system is currently teaching. Even if it's true that there is some minority of private schools who teach something that's very parochial or sort of sheltered or whatever other words are the scary words of the day in terms of describing what might be like a Christian, Jewish, or Muslim education. Usually it's only geared at Christian education. They don't. Even though on a lot of the issues they bring up, like human sexuality, those three religions largely agree on some of the truths about human sexuality. But even if I were to buy the premise that there's some small number of schools that are teaching something intolerant, it can't possibly be as intolerant as teaching, literally splitting kids up by ethnic group, and telling them that they owe each other various either apologies or they owe each other some kind of like essentially fighting reasons to fight, then splitting them up in that way. I mean, I can't think of anything more divisive, honestly, than a curriculum that encourages that kind of ethnic division in a multi-ethnic country. So the data doesn't support the idea that sending kids to private schools or into homeschool makes them more intolerant with regard to those who are different from they are. And in any case, the baseline is so terrible in terms of the public schools teaching this flagrantly divisive rhetoric that I don't see how things could get any worse anyways.
So what if a family uses a voucher to leave a pro-America public school in a rural area or something? Just, I don't know what school we're talking about, what area, but they use it to go to Ibram X. Kendi private school. What are your thoughts on that? Is this, more of just the exception than the norm, and so therefore it's not that big of an issue in your view, or is it? What are your thoughts on that kind of switch happening?
So I'm not somebody who believes that democracy is always the answer, or adding more elements of democracy as opposed to institutions or elected representatives or what have you as interim balance with democracy. I'm not a person who believes that democracy is always the answer. I am, however, in this moment, what I believe is sort of if we are successful, we'll become a second Jacksonian age. I think that the American people, I am like William F. Buckley, man, I'm more than willing to place my chips with the American people. I think the American people are far more pragmatic. I think they have a lot more common sense. And I think that on the whole, conservative ideas can only benefit by shifting the decision-making and the power to parents and families as opposed to institutions and districts. Right now, we know that districts are very far left compared to the average American. Now, are there going to be people who take that money and send their kids to Ibram X. Academy, Ibram X. Kendi Academy? Sure. But again, you got to look at the larger picture. And when you zoom out and look at the larger picture, again, I will place my chips all day, every day on the pragmatism of the American people over the ideology of the elites in this country right now. So I don't lose any sleep thinking about that at all.
That's a clip right there. Right there. Go back like 12 seconds. Cut that
Replay.
up. Perfect. What other we like doing these devil's advocate questions, toward the end of a conversation. So, you got any more, Corey? I'll think of some here too.
Inez, this idea sounds great, but it's just going to defund the public schools, and we can't have that because 90% of kids go to public schools, and you're just talking about 5 to 10% of kids going to private school. Don't you want to help the 90%, not the 10%?
Well, we just went over how they're not underfunded and they haven't done much with the money. So I don't know where they get off with the hubris to sort of keep asking for more money every year, even though what they do with the money is demonstrably not teach kids. So, for example, in Illinois, 89 cents out of every single new education dollar does not go to anything related to the classroom, right? It's going just to pensions. It's going just to hire bureaucrats. For the district system. And I know you guys have probably had him on, Ben Scafidi. I know he's on the board of advisors like I am of EFI. Dr. Ben Scafidi has some fantastic work on how school districts are spending that money and how they are hiring a swarm of bureaucrats to harass our people and eat out our substance, as Thomas Jefferson penned in the Declaration of Independence. They are not rewarding good teachers with higher salaries. They are not buying classroom supplies. This is why people think the system is underfunded, by the way, because they go to their local public school and they see that the air conditioning hasn't been replaced in 20 years and that teachers are using their own money to buy classroom supplies. That the fact that there are shortages on the ground level does not mean there is no money coming in at the top, unfortunately, right? It's a question of where the money is being spent and how the decisions to spend that money are being made. It is not a matter of there not being enough money coming in at the top. It is a matter of poor decision making and shifting resources to bureaucrats rather than to teachers and classrooms. So that's one. I refuse to give into this premise that the schools are cash strapped. It's blatantly false. As Corey, you've gotten some major newspapers to actually place retractions on people who claim the opposite, because it's impossible given the data to honestly claim that schools have been losing money. So that's one. And two, of course, there's an admission in this, right? The admission is that parents won't be happy with what the public schools have on offer and that they will clamor for the exits. And that's the problem, right? I'm actually not a person who believes that public schools as institutions will disappear even if we have universal school choice. I think a lot of families will stay with their neighborhood schools. There's a huge advantage. There's a community advantage to having a school that is sort of contiguous in the neighborhood that all the neighborhood kids go to. There's a critical kind of civic society function that schools actually play, that sports play, all of these things. So actually, I think all things being equal, traditional public schools have a great advantage in this kind of competition. I think that actually all this will do is force them to actually offer a product that parents really do want. I think they have the home court advantage, and if they give away that home court advantage by ignoring parents as they have, especially in the last year and a half, that they have no one to blame but themselves.
Okay, I have one that's closely related to this, Inez. So that's great. We give everyone vouchers, we give ESAs, whatever. They leave the public schools, right? But there's going to be, like you just said, there's going to be some group of kids that just get left behind, right? They continue to go to the public schools. What if they fare worse? They probably will, right? What do you do about them?
Again, as I'm sure you both have repeated many times better than I can, that the studies are the opposite direction there. I think it's, Corey, what is it, 26 out of 27? Studies that show increases in academic achievement in the public schools when families are given a geographically adjacent school choice option, i.e., the competition spurs them to actually make some improvements that they perhaps have not made in absence of having families having the ability to leave. So I don't think of it as left behind or even what students leave the system. I think actually too long we've thought about school choice as a lifeline for people who are worse served by the current system, which it is. I'm not denying that it is, and that's one of its important functions, but that's only one of its important functions. I like to think of it more as leverage for those already in the system. It is school choice will be the wind at your back when you and 10 of your fellow parents go and sit down with the superintendent or sit down with the principal and say, we don't like what our kids are learning. We don't like that they're being taught to divide each other up and to view each other only in light of our racial differences. When you go down and you sit down, you have that meeting, and you bring with you a petition of 50 parents, which is happening in districts all over America, 50, 100, thousands of parents signing these kinds of petitions that are going nowhere, largely. But if you have that kind of petition and you walk into a meeting with the principal and every name on that list is worth $15,000 out of their school budget the next year, all of a sudden you've got leverage in that meeting. And that's what school choice, I think, can bring to families in this country, not just a lifeline, but the leverage necessary to get the changes they actually want done in their public schools.
So a school district in the Phoenix metro area 2 or 3 weeks ago, laid off 152 teachers in response to what you're saying right now. Now, it wasn't so much necessarily, as I understand it anyway, it wasn't so much an issue of curriculum, although maybe that played part, some portion of a role there, but it was in their handling of the pandemic and keeping kids out of school for too long, in the estimation at least of these parents, and also requiring masks. They lost something like on the order of about 4,000 students from this school district. A neighboring school district lost 6,000. In fact, and I mean that one, in that case, they actually lost them. They do not know where those kids are. Not only did they not show up for class when the schools opened, when they reopened, they don't know where they went at all. And so their record keeping is just, there's a loose end there for 6,000 kids. So all that to say, Inez, that you're right. Parents are taking action. They're voting with their feet in a state where they have that option. So the next step is get every state to the point where parents have those options so that they can vote with their feet.
Well, I like Inez's point too, that we don't make often enough, and that even if you're not voting with your feet, now you're in a position of power in that meeting with the school leaders, and now maybe they'll actually listen to you, and you won't even have to leave. So I think it's an excellent point. So we're almost coming up to an hour, Inez. What is your main takeaway? You want people to what do you want to leave people with after this conversation when it comes to the education system in America?
I just, again, repeat myself. It's our job as policy people and advocates for education reform to get you the leverage that you need to do the job. But ultimately, the job has to be done by the American people. And I have enormous faith that they're going to do that tough job. And I think we're already reaching a tipping point where we're seeing more and more people, whether that's in the university system or in the K-12 system, whether it's public or private, we're seeing more and more people stand up and say, this ideology is wrong. It's anti-American, it's pernicious, it's divisive. It's not just conservatives standing up and saying this, it's moderates, it's liberals. We have a ton of great people standing up for what is the truth, that this ideology misrepresents our country. It misrepresents us as Americans and as fellow citizens. And it's dangerous to teach to children, particularly in light of the fact that the education system has failed so spectacularly to teach them the underlying facts about America, basic ones that even just 20 years ago, people took for granted that if you graduated from high school, you would know. So school choice is critical. I'm so pleased to see all these bills going through the states, and it's a very exciting time for education reform. It's unfortunate it had to come at the expense of this crisis for so many families and for the country. But I am optimistic about the future of education reform. But education reform and changing the laws and changing the money around will not do the whole thing, right? It won't save us. The only thing that can save us truly is ourselves, and being brave enough to stand up and call out BS where we see it. And that's the bottom line. We gotta stand up and say it, because the majority actually is with us on these issues. The majority of Americans do not want their kids to learn that this country was founded on in 1619 on chattel slavery. The majority of Americans do still see the value of the principles of 1776. And that now's the time to fight for those values.
Well, you're awesome. I can't believe we haven't done this sooner, Inez, but we appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's been great.
Yeah, totally. For the listeners, I just put into the comments on the Educational Freedom Institute website, we have an active legislation map. You can see bills that are currently floating around in at least 30 states now this session to redirect children's education dollars from institutions to the students, and families would be able to direct that funding to the education provider of their choosing, public or private. So go check that out at the Educational Freedom Institute website. Just a reminder again, this is the Educational Freedom Institute podcast, and our special guest today was Inez Stepman, Senior Policy Analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, and she's also a advisory committee member at the Educational Freedom Institute. We talked a little bit about the school culture wars today. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Again, this is Corey DeAngelis with co-host Matthew Nielsen on the Educational Freedom Institute podcast. See you guys next week.